welcome you to the event that's being hosted by the Department of Management. Tonight we're pleased to have as our guest Dr. Michael O'Malley, who is the Executive Editor of Business, Economics, and Law at Yale University Press, where he's published several award-winning books, such as The Battle for the Soul of Capitalism, Good Capitalism, Bad Capitalism, and Nudge. And tonight he's here to talk to us about his latest book, The Wisdom of Bees, which shows us what managers can learn from bees about decision-making, negotiation, communication, and other topics. We are recording this event tonight, and we hope that it will be made available via podcast. The schedule for tonight is that Michael is going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, after which time we'll have about 20 to 25 minutes of question and answer. And following the event tonight, Michael will be available outside to sign copies of the book, which are available tonight for purchase. So with no further ado, I give you Dr. Michael O'Malley.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. For some of you who are students, my ultimate aim is that someday when you're in the boardroom, a very nice boardroom with exclusive, illustrative peers, and you don't know the answer to a question, I want you to raise your hand and ask, what would a bee do in this situation? So I'm going to talk for 30 or 40 minutes. I cannot cover everything there is to know about bees, but we do have ample time for question and answers covering things that we won't cover. If I were to give this talk a name, it would be Innovation in the Hive, which is a paradoxical title, given that bees for over 100 million years have produced the same product, honey. But you have to give an organization that turns over every 6 weeks and has managed to thrive and survive all of that time a little bit of credit. So their innovation really is in business continuity and in their really uncanny ability to adapt to circumstances. There's 4 things. Now, there are a lot of elements to what bees do, but I've condensed them for this talk into what I would call 4 sort of meta principles, the 4 things that I think bees do that make them so successful. And those 4 things are, and we'll cover each, is they have common goals and interpersonal trust. They protect the future. They are a decentralized organization, and they're extremely effective at managing risk. So common goals, protecting the future, decentralized authority and organization, effective at managing risk. Now, when I write like blogs or articles, if I get a negative comment from anyone, it's usually of the ilk, but bees are not humans. And I can generally concur with that. Bees are smaller, they can fly unassisted, and that sort of thing. But bees, as some introductory material for you, can do a whole lot more than you think, than you might think. For instance, they can count. Only up to 4, but they can count. They can recognize faces and landmarks. They've got great recall. You can expose a bee to you can make a 1 millisecond exposure to a color that they can identify a day later. And then they have 17 different communication signals, which really has given them the moniker of being honorary mammals. They are great communicators. And of course, they're tremendously productive and efficient. They create 200 to 300 pounds. By the way, in grade school, we were told that we were going to have to learn the metric system, but nobody ever does. But I think it's 90 to 140 kilograms of honey per year. per hive, and 1 pound, half a kilogram of honey really involves the visitation of about 2 million flowers. So these are quite industrious animals. However, when people say that that bees are not humans, typically what they're referring to is that we have certain advantages over bees that they don't have. That is, we have to work harder at certain things that bees do not have to work hard at. And I would say, in one way, that's true. That is, bees actually have a common purpose, and that's reproduction and survival. And the hive agrees with that, and all the individual bees agree with that. So there's an identity between what the bees want and what the group wants, which makes things a whole lot easier to manage. I have a couple of friends who are writing a book on what organizations can learn from mutinies. Should be an interesting book. And what they wrote to me and said they found in the Royal Belgian archives a letter from the mutineers to the Spanish Netherlands with the words "mens eadem omnibus" on it. We are all of one mind, and the ornate seal had a swarm of bees on it, and that was dated from 1590. So all of one mind does help the bees quite a bit. Now, that isn't to say, and if you want to ask questions about it later, that there isn't dissension in the hive, because there is. There are occasions when individual bees do act on their own initiative against the will of the group. Hives have a police force, believe it or not, that actually sanction these individuals and bring them back into the fold, so to say. So there are sanctions that promote cooperative behavior in the hive in those occasions when individual bees are actually acting in their own interest rather than the interest of the hive. Well, this commonality also makes trust a whole lot easier as well, and there are many examples. By the way, I don't want to anthropomorphize the bees, and I try very hard in the book not to do that, not to attribute mental states to bees that they truly don't have. But so I'll use trust in the sense that it looks like trust to us if we were looking at it, and there are lots of examples. So, for example, when a bee visits a particular flower that has nectar and extracts it, it will abandon that particular flower, but for an occasion it will check back periodically to see if conditions have changed, just to make sure that the nectar is really gone before finally abandoning the patch and going back to the hive and looking for something else. Well, it could be when that bee returns to the hive that they see another bee communicating to it that you should go back to this very place that you just left. Now, the bee doesn't look at this new informer and say, I was at that spot and there's nothing there, which the organizational corollary of that would be, we've tried that before, it doesn't work. Instead, what the bee does is it goes, because having a common objective, really, there's no reason for a sister, and they're mostly sisters and half-sisters. As you know, the beehive is mainly female. There's no reason for one sister to deceive another if we all want the same thing. Now, yes, so they don't have the transaction costs that we have in terms of mixed motives and interpersonal dissension and disagreements and discord and lies and betrayal and that sort of thing. However, that's why organizations spend time on fashioning vision statements and mission statements and hiring people who subscribe to the purpose of the organization and so forth. These are necessary things for organizations to do. Harder, true, but still necessary, because I would be hard-pressed to call it an organization if you had disparate purposes and had rampant distrust within the organization. So it's one of the essentials and one of the things that bees have, and it makes everything else quite easier for them. Now, the other three things that bees have that I think really promote their effectiveness, again, is they protect the future, they're decentralized, they moderate risk. Now, protecting the future comes in various shapes and sizes. I think the most, the Belgian-born Nobel laureate Maurice Maeterlinck once said, "The god of the bee is the future." So the most evident and obvious aspect of protecting the future is that when a hive discovers a lucrative vein of nectar, they don't all rush off and mine it, no matter how enriched that vein might be. So it's not like they are not running off to gorge themselves on, let's say, high-risk subprime mortgages. What they do instead is that the way they operate is that they will concentrate resources on that particular vein, but they always have an exploratory force out looking for the next new thing, always. And interestingly enough, the worse conditions get, the greater the investment they put in exploration. So their R&D investment increases inversely with how good conditions are, but they always have an R&D capacity. I did a talk this afternoon at Bloomberg, and one of the questions was that, but isn't that counter to what we often find? So sometimes I remember working with a bank executive who had to defend himself with his board by saying, "Why aren't you out buying these subprime mortgages and making all the money everybody else is?" And he said, "Well, because I think it's a bad idea." I remember when Cisco Systems said that they were going to make a huge investment in R&D, and John Chambers, the CEO, was just pillared by the investment community and analysts for forsaking short-term awards for the longer-term benefit. He prevailed. He made his argument. They're doing better. But still, bees have a long-term focus. They're always on the lookout for the next new thing because they can never do without having honey or pollen coming in. If they concentrated their forces in one place and that place became depleted, then they would have to find the next new place, and they would have to do without any income for a while. Number two, another thing that they do to protect the future is that they never wear out their workforce. They never undermine the capability of the bees, the worker bees, to work over the long term. When a bee is born into the world, the expectation is that it will live a long and productive, prosperous life. And the way they do that is that they do it through net versus gross energy. They are not indiscriminate revenue chasers. What they are is that they're not indifferent to the flowers that they look for. They will prefer flowers that are closer to the hive, that are clustered more closely together, that are easier to manipulate and extract the nectar. What they're trying to do is preserve their wings, which wear out, so that they live, in essence, 3 weeks outside the hive as foragers. So hives that have an average, longer average lifespan are more productive hives. And I can give you, I'll give you an example in a second, but curiously, there is a biologist here in town who I had the pleasure of meeting with this morning, Nigel Raine, who just, at the University of London, who just did an experiment that showed that there's a study called the traveling salesman problem, and the problem is that you're given multiple destinations to travel to, and the object for the salesman or saleswoman is to visit all those sites using the shortest possible route without retracing your step. And what he showed is that bees solve that problem faster than a computer can, which is kind of interesting. He doesn't know how they do it yet, but he did show that they can actually calculate the shortest route and solve this traveling salesman problem a lot quicker. The idea is that the bees are trying to conserve their energy for the long run. I did a study for a major retailer about 2 years ago or so, and I actually showed, and this is to illustrate what longevity can do and why the bees really want to be out in the field as long as possible. I showed the company that for every sales associate on the floor, they had to replace that person 3 times in order to keep a steady state of employees. So what happens under these conditions? Well, they start hiring every warm body that walks in the door. They whisk them through training, if they give them training at all, and they put them out on the floor, and often at the worst times with the highest volumes, and so they quit and so forth, and the cycle begins. Well, the same thing happens with bees. If they die young, they actually try to produce more bees. They send them out into the world prematurely. They die young, and a vicious cycle begins, and ultimately the hive dies out. So they want to actually keep the focus on outside world rather than on internal operations. The third thing that they do to protect the future is they have managed out anything that interferes with the long-term performance of the group. In essence, beehives are meritocracies. There's no nepotism in the hive, no genetic favorites. The thing that matters most is productivity. If the larvae are infected and have no chance of succeeding in the hive, they're thrown out. The drones, which are the males of the hive, let me just say a few things about the drones. The drones are rather large bees. They have big eyes, bigger to see the queen with. And they're very powerful flyers. And they, during mating season, they congregate in an area which are called congregation areas, which you can think of as sort of a pub in the sky, and they wait for the queen to come along, and 10 to 15 drones mate with the queen. And if they're successful, if you want to call it that, because they lose some essential inner parts during this process and die in an aerial freefall. So those that are successful die. Those that are unsuccessful return to the hive, hang out, maybe go for some leisurely flights on nice summer days, maybe figure out how to create mead from honey, but they hang out, and they really don't do a whole lot. However, come fall, when the workers need the honey to survive on through the winter, and they don't need the drones discover that if you want to eat the honey, you have to contribute to the hive. And since they're not contributing to the hive, the workers throw them out. So they're not productive, they're cast off. I know the women love this, I know. And it's a one-sided affair, by the way. The female workers have stingers, drones do not have stingers. So it's no contest. They're thrown out. Productivity actually even relates to the queen herself. When the queen's productivity begins to decline, it is sensed by the workers. And decline for the queen means that she's starting to lay fewer eggs. On average, a queen lays 1,500 to 2,000 eggs per day. Sounds like an awful job, but that's what she does. The workers sense a decline, and when that decline begins, the workers begin to prepare for a successor. And I would say that is the fourth long-term principle that bees have, and that is that they are very good at succession planning. They cannot do without a queen. They will have trouble existing if they waited too long for the queen to be unproductive, because it takes 30 days from inception to productivity for a queen to fully develop. That is a long time in bee years, and it would put the hive at risk. So succession planning is very important in the hive. I'll just say a few words about how they actually choose successors. The worker bees create 12 to 15 cells, which are a little bit larger than normal. Queen lays an egg in it, fertilizes it. The queen, the aspiring queen, then is fed on a very rich diet of royal jelly, and which is high protein content. So basically, the food makes the woman in this case. It alters her genetic makeup, and they develop into queens versus workers through this. Now, the first queen out gets the job, basically. So the first one out is the most developed and the most mature queen. She quickly dispatches with her sisters and half-sisters by stinging them through their cell walls or as they're emerging. So they eliminated. And the idea really is, look, we think we have a capable person here, a capable queen here. We don't want to engage in a lengthy process, so the first one out wins. Now, I would say that this is often different from businesses. People often ask me, are there any differences? And this would be different because in the hive, the first one there, the first in line usually is the most mature. In business, sort of the first on the bus, the next in line isn't necessarily the best one for the job. So so there are some differences there. They wait for the queen to do her mating flight, the new queen to engage in her mating flight, and return before they keep the old queen on until the new queen returns and is productive. A lot of beekeepers see two queens in hives. I've seen it in our own hives. As long as the old queen is willing to accept emeritus status and go off to a corner and not lay eggs and not bother anyone, she will not be killed. However, if she does bother somebody, she will be dispatched with, because the idea in the end is that there can only be one queen, which I think is interesting because at least in the United States, there's been a lot of commentary lately on dual leadership, and I've been involved in so many of these occasions where, most often, it's a merger, and let's say you're putting the two information technology departments together, and rather than making a decision between person A and B, they make them twin heads, which is the worst thing you can do. If you're ever in that position, make a decision, because it confuses employees, it gives them mixed messages. One decision is overridden by another. The only time I've seen dual heads work is with startups where you have founders who know each other and work together, know what each other's strengths and weaknesses are, and can nicely segment their responsibilities. And then I've seen it work in family businesses too. I'm friends with the Smucker family. Both of the brothers get along famously. They like each other, and they've divided up their responsibilities. So, but usually one leader is enough, and that's all the hive will tolerate. Just as a quick aside, sometimes the culture of a hive becomes disadvantageous. It usually becomes susceptible to disease, or the bees can become overly aggressive. In that case, you need an outsider to step in and change the bloodline of the hive. That is, the only way to change the culture is to bring in a new queen. Now, in an organization, that would be the board, for instance, saying, I think we need to change things. The culture isn't quite the way we want it anymore. In the hive, it's the beekeeper that decides. But I will say this, if a beekeeper just puts, and I guess there are some beekeepers in here, if a beekeeper just puts a new queen into the old hive, there is a over 50% chance that she will get what's called heat-balled. The workers will surround her, pressurize her, and heat her to an intolerable temperature and kill her. And the reason is that she's an unproven outsider and an unknown. So if you ever are introduced into a new company, please don't get heat-balled. And the way to avoid that, I've seen, the one way to avoid that, the way beekeepers avoid it is they put the queen in a cage with like some candy cork on the end, so it takes a while for the worker bees to eat through it, and so it gives time for the bees and the queen to get acclimated to one another and to their scents and so forth. But what I've seen CEOs do is say, all right, I'm going to make a few changes immediately that are obvious to me, but I'm going to spend the first 90 days listening, and then after that we're going to get serious. So, it's sort of setting up a time that we can actually get to know one another, but after this period is gone, and then we'll move on. So those are all the ways that hives can protect the future. They preserve their ability to perform over time, their capacity to perform. There's no nepotism or favoritism, and they look ahead for successor queens or leaders. The next thing that I want to mention is that, contrary to what a lot of people believe about the hive, is that the queen has very little to do with the activity of the hive. The queen lays eggs. She emits pheromones that keep the workers around her from producing queens prematurely. And then she has chemical messages that she sends out. It's more like a goal-setting cascade. The queen has an entourage of groomers, and they actually pick up her scent, and then they pass that scent on to other workers who pass it on to other workers, and it spreads throughout. And what this chemical conveys is that the queen is in, she's healthy, and all is well in the land, and you don't have to worry, because when she's not there, the bees do start to worry. And there are some detrimental things that go on. So it's really to keep the hive calm, knowing that the queen is in. So most of the decisions made in the hive are not made by the queen. They're made by individual workers who are closest to the action. So it is truly an empowered organization. It is almost entirely decentralized. Things from rearing the young to taking out the trash to foraging are made by individual workers based on local cues and communication. Now, the perfect example of this comes with swarming in bees. When a hive gets, a hive has a fixed capacity. It only gets so big. It can only store so much honey and accommodate so many workers. So it gets to a point where adding workers would have nothing to do. They would be bringing in honey that could not get stored and would never get consumed. So it gets to a side where big is inefficient. And when big is inefficient, they divest themselves of a part of themselves. A little less than half of the hive leaves the parent colony and looks for a new home. Now, if you've ever seen a swarm, they're very scary looking, but they're harmless. So they're great balls of bees that look like soccer balls, and they go hang on a limb somewhere. And they send out a couple of hundred scout bees to look for their new home. And the new home has certain characteristics that they're looking for. It has to, it should be so far off the ground. It should have certain cavity size. The entrance size should be so large. It should be facing a certain direction. So they all go out and they look for this. And these couple hundred bees then come back to the swarm and communicate. And maybe in the question and answer we can demonstrate how they communicate. It's their famous waggle dance is how they communicate. It tells them, how far something is away, which direction to go in, and how good it is when you get there. So it's the how good that we need to know for now. So they come back, and on average, these workers the average is 24 sites. They will advertise 24 possible sites for their new home. They run little circles, and the more circles they run, the more excited they are about that particular site, and it's a direct correlation between the actual properties of those sites. So the faint-hearted It's kind of okay, you might want to look at it. They'll run a few circles, but hey, I think I found the perfect home for us. They'll run a lot of circles. The other bees, the other uncommitted scouts will see these bees advertising their sites, and they will go visit these various sites. They won't necessarily make an immediate commitment. All right, I'll go look at your site. They may come back and say, all right, before I make a decision, I'm going to go look at 2 or 3 other sites as well. Well, what happens over time is that a quorum develops. That is, they all sort of coalesce on one of the possible sites. And once a quorum is reached, they send out signals to warm their flight muscles, and then they do these things called buzz runs to say, all right, we're moving. By the way, I should say they try to give these spin-offs the best chance of succeeding as possible. The old queen goes with the spin-off, with the swarm. They send a disproportionate number of younger bees who have longer to live and can help the colony when it settles. And they send stores of honey. So they're trying to give it the best chance possible. So they take off. So a couple of things that I want to say about this process. One is that they adhere to what I would in management call debate, decide, and act. So they have their debate, they make their decision, and then they act. Sort of the discussion is over. Once a quorum is reached, we've made up our mind, we're going to our new home, period. And by the way, we're all going together, and the way the bees do that is that they have something called streaker bees that shoot through the swarm at very high rates in the direction of the new home. So the bees that see the streaker bees, follow them. The bees that are following the streaker bees follow them. So they actually all move together consistently to their new home. So debate, decide, act. We're all in agreement. This is where we're going. The other part of this process, I think, is important to management is that somewhere out in the world, I'm sure, is the perfect home for the bees, but they cannot afford to look ad nauseum for the perfect home because they're hanging from a tree branch. They have limited reserves. They are susceptible to the weather and predators, so they have to make a decision. And so the decisions that bees make are often, all they have to be is good enough decisions, not perfect decisions. So there's a difference between incomplete information and insufficient information. And they will act on incomplete but sufficient information. Which is important. Decisions just have to be good enough, particularly when they have to be quick decisions. There are a couple of things that make, now empowerment often gets a very bad name because often, and I've seen it, it's an executive that says, okay, I've been making too many decisions myself. I'm distributing accountability. You all now are accountable, all right, for decisions, which to a lot of people, you wonder what that means. But consider why empowerment works, decentralization works in the hive. And it works for really 3 reasons. One is that they have a very sound decision process that they use. And if you're interested, it's called the collective wisdom hypothesis. It's the Marquis de Condorcet who developed it. They remove bias from their decision-making process in 2 ways. One is that they actually produce a range of options to assess. So it's not one person saying we're just going to entertain these 1 or 2 options. They remove bias by sampling from a wide array of possibilities. The other way they remove bias is by having independent assessments of each of those options. So in a company you may have, let's say it's the most powerful person in the company saying we should do this, and then everybody agreeing, and then you have a cascade effect which may be a wrong decision. In the hive, each bee is independently making their own decision about which home is correct. So a wide set of options, independently assessed, guarantees or assures that the decision that they're going to make is as unbiased as possible. They have a great communication system, number 2. Not only the waggle dance, which is, beautiful in and of itself and very succinct, but their communication system is a parallel system as well, in that you have multiple pieces of information coming into the hive. It's redundant, and the best information is always overwhelming the bad information. So, the more circles that they're running, that information is louder than the information where somebody is faint-hearted and making fewer circles. And by the way, we don't have to get into it, but basically, if you lose some information, you'll still have another bee that likes that site. It will come in. So you have redundant information with the best information getting passed on. Communication is great in the hive. And the last thing is that they have competent workers. The scouts are the oldest and most experienced foragers in the field that are sent out to find the house for the new home. So they send their best out to look for the home, who are accustomed to flying long distances, which, by the way, can be up to 12 kilometers. They fly great distances to find homes and food. And also, just as an aside, you should know that bees have mentoring programs. The novice, you become a forager at 3 weeks. Novice bees follow the veteran bees into the field to learn how to navigate better, to manipulate flowers better, how to move from flower to flower better. And what you see are learning curves over time. So over time, what you see is that bees are able to carry more pollen and nectar and make more trips to and from the hive with time. So they're actually watching the veteran bees do this. So there's a learning that goes on. And there's actually self-learning that goes on too, but we need not get into that. The last thing, there are a lot of things that they do to mitigate risk, but I think in the time that we have, I'm going to mention one very important element, and that's diversity is critical in the hive. The more diverse the hive, more diverse hives are better at everything. They're better at rearing the young, they're better at comb building, they're better at foraging. And the reason, the diversity in the hive really comes from the fact that they have multiple fathers, multiple patrolines. Remember, they have 10 to 12 fathers. So that's how diversity is introduced into the hive. The more diverse, the better the hive, because the bees are sensitive to a wider range of cues. So for instance, in foraging, a more diverse hive will travel further, so they'll explore a wider range of area, and they will actually gather nectar from a greater variety of flowers. So they're more sensitive to more environmental events, which keeps them open, which prevents them from being too narrowly focusing on too few things. But here's the other thing diversity does, which is important. And we introduce diversity in different ways in our organization, and there's, of course, the surface characteristics, which are, I don't want to talk about, but there are the other things, and that is, divergent interests and hobbies and curiosities and entrepreneur. There are a lot of ways of bringing in different kinds of people who subscribe to the organizational purposes. Well, the other thing that diversity does in the hive, however, I'll just describe what happens in the hive, and then I'll tell you what the consequences are. The hive tries to keep bees keep the hive at a relatively constant temperature of 93 to 95 degrees, or 34 Fahrenheit, 34 to 35 degrees centigrade. But they don't all. And what they do is they contract their wings to heat the hive, or they flap their wings to cool it. But they don't contract and flap their wings at the same time. They turn on and off at different times. Some are doing nothing, some are turning on, some are turning off. And the whole idea is to keep the band of temperature very narrow, because if they all turned on and off at the same time, you would start to get oscillations, and the temperatures would be too extreme. So just by way of an analogy, just picture a ship with all hands on deck, and all of the crew members are exactly alike. And let's just say the ship starts to tilt. But being non-diverse, they all respond the same way to the same cue, and so they all run to the other side of the ship, and then it tips, and they run back and forth until it capsizes. So the other value of diversity is diversity produces stability in the hive, and that's one of the ways they protect themselves from. Just quickly, two other things, and then we'll open up to questions, because there are other ways that they mitigate. You know, bees live in the same unpredictable world we do, and so they have to. Their theory is, you know, hope for the best, plan for the worst, and they're always planning for the worst. And they do make mistakes. The kinds of mistakes they make, they choose what kind of mistakes they're going to make. So I think that's valuable. Sometimes in business, you're going to make a mistake. What you have to decide is what kind of mistake are you willing to make, and bees have that. And the other part of bees, which we didn't touch on, is that they have a very defined career progression. You start with the easiest jobs, and the bee moves gradually out toward the periphery of the hive until it becomes a forager. It's a very defined progression, but they have flexibility built into that so that they never lose a key functionality that they need. So they can, for instance, accelerate development of certain bees, precocious bees, we would call them fast trackers in business. They have slack resources that they can pull on, and they also cross-train in the hive, so that they have amazing, I call it flexigidity. It's a rigid structure with some flexibility built into it, but it really enables them to quickly adapt to changing circumstances. So time is up, so then I thought we could open it up to questions.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, we are going to open it up to questions. I just have two things to ask of you. First, if you wouldn't mind waiting until the microphone gets to you before you ask your question. The second thing is, could you please try and ask questions and not deliver lectures back to Michael? So it'd be much appreciated to kind of just get to the question. So with that, we have some microphones that are going to be coming around.
Hello, sir. Hi. I want to know, according to you, what is the behavioral difference between the system, the difference in system between the bees and the ants?
Oh. Well, you got me there, because I'm not an ant expert. But you know, I mean, personally, I'm more interested in bees because ants tend to follow pheromone trails, you know, and they're more limited in terms of their movement. I mean, I'm more interested in bees because of the flexibility of movement. But I think if you ask E.O. Wilson, he would disagree with what I've just said, that the ants are, you know, very fancy. I just don't know ants well enough to comment.
What company do you think most closely matches a bee colony?
You know, that is a very interesting question, and the reason it's the reason you got me is because I do name that company in the book, and it's Johnson & Johnson. But boy, they're having so many problems now that I. You know, I have consulted them for many years, and you know, they were very decentralized. They had all the things that I discussed, but boy, are they having quality problems right now. So I mean, I named Johnson & Johnson in the book, but I think I may have to retract that, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much for this insightful lecture. I know that you're going to speak at the FT conference soon on innovations of bees. Now, it seems that evolution has given bees this incredibly diverse and efficient tool set, like the mentoring program and the communication devices and so on. But it resembles routines for me, organizational routines that make companies as efficient as the beehives that we just talked about. But what is the role of innovation in a hive, and how do bees innovate to become even more efficient?
Did you say routines? Did you mention the idea of routines?
Yes.
The bees have routines. I'm trying to think of the German word that I use in the book for it. The management word is entrainment. They actually have routines. They don't just get up and start looking for flowers. They actually have a particular rhythm that they have. They know at what times to look for what kinds of flowers. So they're very entrained to their environment, which is they're routinized, which is one of the ways that they are so efficient.
These are routines, but what is the role of innovation for bees? Because this is what you're going to talk about soon at the economy.
The role of that. I think the innovation that the bees have really is organizational innovation, and not the kind of not product innovation or anything. I think the innovation that they have is really an ability to quickly adapt to conditions. That to me is you only have certain decision criteria. You can adapt to the environment. You can change yourself. You can get out. You can withdraw from the environment. So what they're very good at is deciding which decisions to make and when and how fast. Yeah. Yes. Yes, sir.
I would first like to thank you for your interesting presentation. I'd just like to know, how do bees respond when humans try to extract honey from the beehives? And then during the crisis situation, how do they respond?
Not well. How do they respond when they've taken out honey? For the most part, you can walk around hives and they don't bother you. And I've been around, 50 hives and walking through them and they don't bother you. But you take off the lid and you try to remove a frame, they get very angry with that. They will sting you, and in those situations. So you use a smoker that disorients them. It actually also confuses the pheromones and chemicals that they give off, so it makes communication between them more difficult. But I will say this, and you do learn it maybe the hard way, and that is, if you get stung by a bee, they give off a pheromone, and that pheromone calls other bees. So start running. So I learned that so there's all kinds of things like they're not supposed to like the dark, and I remember once being chased by bees, and I'm running into the garage. Hey, you're not supposed to be in here. You're not supposed to be in here. But at any rate, yes, they do attract others to the call per se. Yes, sir.
Dr. O'Malley, thank you very much for that most interesting talk. You brought up the concept of a common goal as shared by bees. Is there any sense of competition between hives?
Between hives?
Yes.
They no. Let me see how do I want to put this. There's a lot to answer. First of all, for the most part, no. But I will say this: that each hive has a unique genetic and environmental signature built into their wax, and so one hive knows where another bee comes from. They know there are in-groups and there are out-groups, even among two hives. So if a bee from one hive tried to enter another hive, it would be kicked out. There are guard bees that would keep them out, and that's because of the scent that they have. So they're each unique. But I think you raise an interesting point, and that is you cannot just put two beehives together and expect it to work, because at least one of the hives will throw out the bees of the other hive. So if you're ever involved in a merger, for instance, it always helps to mix the wax together to create a brand new entity where all feel a part of the new place. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So you cannot mix two hives together without mixing the wax. And there are some variations to that, but that is sort of the bottom line. And I think too often in mergers, we invite one group over, but they are perceived as outsiders, and that's what happens in the hive. Yes.
Thanks. I'm wondering, under what circumstances do individual bees actually lose their coordination or subordination to the common goal? You mentioned it earlier on. And second of all, how is that dealt with? Sorry, are they just killed, or can they be re-educated somehow?
Which bees being killed?
The ones that lose their sort of subordination to the common goal. Can they be re-educated, or do they just get killed?
There are a couple of things. One is that the way they two things. The way they communicate primarily is on the dance floor of the hive, which is always vertical. So that's where the action is taking. I will say that they have a unique, what I would call an RSS feed in the hive, because the honeycomb actually has a little lip, and the bees will flick that lip, and they'll send out a low-frequency signal through the hive. That signal travels the furthest the more distal a bee is, right? So if a bee is standing on the periphery, what the signal is saying, come over here and see what's being said, you're too far away. You're not getting the message. So they actually do have a very sophisticated knowledge management system that brings all the bees together where they can actually see and coordinate with one another. Now, in terms of, they try not to kill the individual, some worker bees have functional ovaries, and they can lay eggs. It's particularly when the queen is absent that they actually start doing, that actually accelerates. But individual bees will start laying eggs. These are unfertilized eggs that can only develop into males. It's a very bad thing for the colony. And so what the police force does is it stops them from laying eggs and then will destroy the eggs. So that's how they actually keep these individualistic bees in track. They don't kill the bees. They will stop them and destroy their eggs, basically.
Yes, sir.
Hello. You have said that during crisis time, the bees actually increase the investment in their R&D. Okay, today we are still living in the crisis, and the biggest companies have cost reduction, laying off a lot of people, even the most competent ones, because they want to reduce cost. Do you have an example of a company that had increased investment in R&D during crisis, and now they are having much better business thanks to that, though all competitors maybe have reduced their cost?
So are there examples of R&D expenditures where the companies have done better? Is that?
I mean, yeah, during crisis, one of the companies said, okay, we will not reduce cost. Oppositely, we will increase dramatically the R&D, and maybe after 2 years, the outcome was really positive compared to the others.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there are any companies that wouldn't have tried to reduce costs, but they would but they would increase their R&D nonetheless, because there are always ways you can cut costs. Now, whether or not, I think we're going to have to see whether or not it succeeds. The companies that I mentioned in the book that have maintained or increased R&D investment during the downtime is 3M and Intel are two of them. Cisco, I already mentioned, is another. I think we have to wait to see if those investments actually pay off or not, but all of them have tried to cut costs in other ways, just not in research and development.
Yes, sir.
As I understand it, the reason that bee division of labour and all of the positive biological management, in inverted commas, systems work so well is because of the genetic relatedness and the identical twins and half-identical twins, and hence altruism survives. And as I understand it, as a zoologist, it's because of the altruism that the colony is successful and that the social insects are successful, bees and ants and termites. Why haven't you alluded to that and suggested that it's the promotion of some sort of altruism or pseudo-altruism which might be good in business management? Because if you can do that, then the rest will follow, I feel. Right. Why haven't you mentioned that?
Well, how would you define, let me ask you how you would define, before you, how would you define, what would be an evidence of altruism in the hive, as you would define it?
The preparedness of workers to sting and risk their lives in defence of the colony.
Right. Yes, there is quite a bit of sacrifice. You know, I have never. I will have to say that I've read thousands of articles. I have never seen one that actually addresses altruism within the beehive.
So it's total loyalty to the colony and.
What, I'm sorry?
Total loyalty, up to the point of death.
But you're right. There is a, well, you know, to some extent, you know, and maybe it will be corrected. You know, bees can sting other insects and survive. It's only however, they have not adapted yet to stinging mammals. You know, their stinger is like a harpoon that has a little curve on it. And when bees sting mammals, it gets stuck under our skin. So, you know, maybe they'll adapt. Maybe you know, in another 100 million years, they'll be able to sting mammals and survive. But there's quite a bit of sacrifice in the hive, including the drones, right? I suppose you could call it some sense of altruism or goodwill toward the whole. I mean, they most definitely are programmed to preserve, to reproduce, and to preserve themselves and to survive. No doubt about that.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
You've spoken very positively about the bees, which is music to my ears as a beekeeper. But there are certain ruthless practices in the hive that you haven't mentioned. They have no time for the weak and feeble. They're rejected. If somebody's sick, they're thrown out. I hope there aren't any parallels there in management, or are there?
Well, I did mention the larvae that were infected. They do get thrown out. You know, I actually, in the book, I take a positive spin. Yeah, there is a very harsh reality in the hive. They do have undertakers. It's one of the jobs, right? And that's to throw out bees that are diseased or deceased. But you know what the interesting thing about it is that before they actually engage in that, they do a little dance that says, I'm having problems, I have mites, or I have something on me, can somebody groom me? So they do grooming dances that call other bees to help. So there is this internal assistance as well. So I guess in the book I chose to build up the, help me first, before you kick me out. But yeah, there are some brutal aspects to the beehive. But I do think the expectation is for a bee is to, their expectation is for it to live, on average the full 6 weeks, a healthy life. But if it comes to the point where they are diseased and it would threaten the life of the hive, then they do in fact take the kinds of actions that you're suggesting. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Have you considered other insects like wasps or yellow jackets?
No, I haven't. I haven't. Only to stay away from yellow jackets. I mean, and the only thing that I do discuss in the book, I do talk a little about bumblebees because, and actually the fellow I talked to this morning, Professor Rain, is actually a bumblebee expert, and I was asking him this, and he concurred, and that is. Honeybees dominate bumblebees, and the way they do it is through sheer speed. They outmaneuver them. And I actually use Zara, which I'm a big fan of, for clothing, when they can when you can rip off clothes in 2 weeks and put it on shelves. To me, that's pretty remarkable. But what happens is they actually beat the bumblebees to the nectar. They drain all the nectar before the bumblebees can even get there, and they have greater coverage and so forth. So, the only way I actually introduce another kind of insect into the book is that honeybees actually are formidable competitors to other insects, only because they can quickly find new places to harvest and actually go out in force to do it.
Yes, ma'am.
You said that if there was a bit of time, you would explain a bit more about the dance, the waggle dance.
Yes.
Could you tell us a bit
Does
more
anybody,
about it?
Can anybody actually do it? You're a beekeeper. You can do the dance. Yes, everything is done on the vertical in the hive. So the comb is vertical. Straight up on the comb represents the sun. So, all right, so, so straight up is the sun, all right? And then what happens is they start their dance at a particular place relative to straight up. So let's say they start the dance here. What they do is they cut across this hypothetical line, which is the vertical. They do a little waggle, by the way, in the middle. And they go counterclockwise along and stopping at the same spot that they started at, and they do it again, and then this time they go clockwise. So what they're telling them is that this angle between the vertical and where they cross the line, when you leave the hive, go 60 degrees, for instance, to the right of the sun. That's the direction you need to go in. So straight up is representing the sun. They're telling each other what angle to go at when they leave relative to the sun. The waggle tells them how far to go. The waggle actually is more of a rate because it actually takes into account things like wind condition and environmental circumstances. So on 2 given days, let's say a bee is traveling from this point to here, one day it may convey a further distance because, let's say, there's a headwind. So they take that into account. So the waggle actually is more of a rate rather than purely a distance. And the number of circles that they do, the clockwise and counterclockwise, tells the bees how good it is. So you're told the angle, what angle from the sun you need to go in. You're told how far to go. And you're told how good it's going to be when you get there. It's pretty amazing. Karl von Frisch won the Nobel Prize by figuring that little tidbit out. But it's a very succinct communication signal. So, I mean, for the most part, bees keep it simple, which I think is always a good thing in organizations too. Try to keep it simple.
Yes, sir.
Does the bee model analogy apply to all type of businesses, or it might be applicable more to certain type of businesses? What I mean is, an engineering firm and a law firm and a data firm have different scopes and different organizations. Does the analogy apply to all of them, or it applies more to one of them?
That's a good question, and I would have to say that I really haven't contemplated that in any sufficient depth. What I have done, though, is thought about ways that certain aspects of the bees can apply to certain, kinds of operations. So I had consulted to a call center not too long ago, and I said, we're going to use one measure to rearrange sort of labor, and that is when a forager bee brings nectar back to the hive, there are receiver bees there to collect the nectar. It's the receiver bees then that mix in some enzymes, transform the nectar to honey, and then go store it into the comb. It's the speed with which the forager can find a receiver that tells them whether or not the labor force is appropriately divided. So if they find a receiver bee right away, then they need more foragers. They can accommodate more foragers, and so they call from a reserve. Come on, come on. We need you. So for the call center, I said, I think to reposition your work, what we're going to do is how long a call will wait. How long does a caller have to wait? So, but beyond that, so I think you can pick and choose certain things that might apply to different kinds of businesses, but I'd be hard pressed to say that everything that I've discussed about bees would uniformly, always apply to every aspect of a business.
One last question up there. Yes, sir.
You mentioned about the mistakes that the bee community would like to take, and they decide which mistakes they would like to do. So who will decide on these mistakes that they would like to do it and take the risk of these mistakes? And do bee community would learn from their mistakes, so their future they can take that, so they will not do that mistake again as the same community, or it has to happen after like 6 weeks, there's a new community and they might do the same mistake again?
Yes. Okay. So, wow, that's a lot of questions. One is they actually, to avoid some mistakes, they do get involved with what I would call self-learning. So, for instance, they do these experiments where there's like a wheel that rotates, and they have like fake flowers on some of them, and one of them has a real nectar in it, and the bee flies to where the real nectar is. But then, while the bee is there, they turn the wheel. So, and the idea is that the bee will have to come back to where it is, not where it was. And so what the bees do is they do this corkscrew flight to learn to say, all right, it's not where it was, it's over here. When I come back, this is the spot I'm coming to. So there is this self-learning that goes on within the hive. With regard to, I have two more things. With regard to, and I think it's very interesting, by the way, with regard to the foragers and the receivers, the foragers are always making the decision. They actually know what the outside world is like. They know how many receivers are involved. Receivers never have anything to say whatsoever about how to reposition the workforce. And I actually think, when I think about applications to business, is that really what you want to do is maximize your revenue, and you want the people who are aware of what's going on making those decisions. I think the receivers would be, we're really busy right now. We can't really build too much more comb, so, and so-and-so's out, so we can only accommodate, so much. They don't want that. The foragers control that conversation. In terms of what mistakes they make, they actually have the same kinds of issues that businesses have. They have resource allocation problems. Comb is very expensive in terms of energy to make. It's made from sugars. The wax is made from sugars from honey, and it has to be heated, thermoregulated. So that's a lot of energy. And they don't want, and what bees do not want to do is build too much honey when times are bad, or build too little when times are good. So that's the mistake they don't want to make. And so what they've chosen instead is they have a variable threshold that they use. So if times are good, the threshold is the comb does not have to be that filled for them to start building. If times are bad, then the comb has to be pretty filled for them to start building. Because the mistake that they would rather make is we'd rather overbuild if times are good and underbuild if times are bad. So those are the kinds of mistakes, so that how they arrived at that is a 100-million-year-old question, but that's how they protect themselves. They just don't. A mistake in the hive is death. So so they really do want to be. They really are a risk-averse bunch for the most part.
Great. Well,
hello.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Okay. I heard that occasionally bee attacks other beehives. Why should it be, if it is such a magnanimous insect? Why should they attack somebody else in order to steal their honey?
Yes, they do steal each other's honey sometimes, but it's usually not a big problem if the honey is flowing very well. First of all, they won't. They don't even care, by the way. If the honey is flowing, then they'll let anybody in, pretty much. There's very few guard bees. If times are really tight, then the guard bees will keep out others. But for the most part, they're not trying to raid each other. They're actually all out trying to find nectar. So the issue of raiding each other tends not to be a very big issue in the hive. But it does happen, but not to a great extent.
Great. Well, thank you all for your questions. Before we go, I have we're actually not finished yet, but there is something I need to ask of you. When we do finish tonight, if you could all please stay seated until Michael has left, so that we can get him out to the lobby and get him set up so that he can meet all of you after the event. Before that, however, we have actually a surprise for you, Michael. In addition to our Nobel laureates, we also have LSE bees. And there are some students who've come along tonight who would like to present you with a little present.
So in April of this year, LSE welcomed 2 urban beehives to a rooftop in Passfield Hall. You can see pictures of some of them here. We're now one of the first university halls of residence with its own bees. Next year, we hope each hive will produce between 50 and 100 pounds of honey, which the school aims to sell and donate any proceeds back into sustainability projects in halls of residence. As the LSE bees are new colonies, most of the honey has been left and will be used to see them through this winter. So in September, we harvested just a little bit of honey to taste. And here, Antash and Nikki have one of those jars. Which we present to you on behalf of LSE staff and students. And thank you for raising awareness about the importance of bees.
Thank you very much.
And that might be small, but in central London, that's about 100 pounds worth.
Well, there's no other honey like this in the world. It's true. This is a signature of a place. There's no other honey that's exactly like this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, guys. All right. Well, thank you again to all of you for coming tonight. Let's thank Michael one more time. And if I hope you all take a moment to say hello to Michael outside and have a good night.